Today, we're looking at three very different lives. First up, there's Brad down in southern Australia. His wife Linda is having to watch him completely lose control to a prescription painkiller, basically watching a peaceful family man turn into someone she just doesn't even recognize anymore. Then over in Berlin, Germany, there's Marco. He's only 23 and he's already figured to forge medical prescriptions, all just to feed a worsening addiction. And then, thousands of miles away in Togo, West Africa, a moto taxi driver named Zico is popping a pill known on the streets as the poor man's cocaine just so he can physically endure a grueling 12-hour shift.
Now, on the surface, you'd think these are just disparate human tragedies, right? Completely unrelated. But actually, there's an invisible thread connecting these three men across the globe. And that thread? It leads directly back to a quiet industrial town in Germany and a massively profitable $1.9 billion pharmaceutical company called Grünenthal.
So it forces us to ask a pretty provocative question. Are we looking at a brand new opioid crisis, but this time one made in Germany? See, while the world has been super focused, and rightly so, on the devastating American opioid epidemic, folks at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs have been sounding a totally different alarm. They aren't just looking at American companies anymore. They're hyper-focused on the global spread of synthetic opioids developed by Grunenthal. We're talking specifically about two drugs here, Tramadol and tapentadol. Part 1. The Science of Opioids. Now, to truly wrap our heads around the scale of this potential crisis, we can't just look at the corporate side of things. We've got to start with the biology to see how these incredibly powerful painkillers actually hijack the human body.
First off, let's get our terms straight, because the distinction here is absolutely crucial. An opiate, that's a naturally occurring substance derived right from the sap of the opium poppy. Think of drugs like morphine. An opioid, on the flip side, is basically the umbrella term for all substances that act on your body's opioid receptors, which includes fully or partially synthetic drugs cooked up in a lab. So while morphine is an opiate, the highly potent drugs at the center of our explainer today, Tramadol and tapentadol, are synthetic opioids.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why these drugs are both a medical miracle and incredibly dangerous. When you get injured, your body naturally releases endorphins. These little chemical messengers bind to specific opioid receptors along your nerves, literally blocking the pain signals from ever reaching your brain. Well, synthetic opioids mimic that exact natural process. They bind to those same receptors, making severe pain totally bearable. But here's the catch. As your body adapts, it builds a tolerance. You suddenly need more of the drug just to get the same relief. And that can rapidly lead to severe addiction and even a fatal slowing of your respiratory system.
Let's put this into perspective historically. Humanity's quest to conquer pain has repeatedly led to mass addiction. Hippocrates was actually writing about opium way back in 400 BC. Fast forward to the 1800s, a German pharmacist isolates morphine, which totally revolutionized modern pain therapy. But then, get this, in 1898, pharmaceutical giant Bayer launched heroin. Yes, literally heroin. And they marketed it as a safe, non-addictive cough medicine. Unbelievable, right? And of course, we all know the 1990s, when Purdue Pharma aggressively pushed OxyContin, fueling a massive crisis in the US. History pretty much shows us that whenever we invent a new miracle painkiller, a dark shadow is usually following right behind it.
Part 2. A controversial corporate history. And that historical context leads us directly to the origins of Grunenthal. Because to really understand their modern playbook and how they operate today, we have to take a hard look at their deeply controversial past.
So, Grünenthal was founded in West Germany in 1946, and those early days are actually shadowed by reports that they employed several high-ranking scientists with ties to the Nazi era. But they gained global infamy about a decade later. In 1957, they launched thalidomide, sold as Contergan, which was a tranquilizer heavily prescribed to pregnant women for morning sickness. The result? One of the worst medical disasters in human history, causing an estimated 12,000 severe birth defects. Now, the company has since formally apologized and set up a foundation for survivors, but at the time, their reputation was in absolute ruins. They desperately needed a comeback, and in 1977, they got one when they launched a brand new synthetic opioid, Tramadol.
Part 3, the Tramadol playbook. Tramadol became a massive, undeniable success, eventually ranking among the world's most prescribed painkillers. Now, back then, it was largely considered a weak opioid, but recent investigative journalism has pulled back the curtain on its regulatory history, showing us exactly how Grünenthal protected its star product the minute red flags started popping up.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast in strategies. When investigators compared Grünenthal to Purdue Pharma, they found totally different tactics at play. Purdue used a hard approach, direct, aggressive sales, blatant claims that OxyContin wasn't addictive.
Grunenthal's playbook, according to the source material, relies entirely on soft power. It's this incredibly subtle influence achieved by quietly funding patient associations, sponsoring internal peer-reviewed research, and just embedding themselves deeply into the regulatory conversation.
And we really have to remember the stakes here. 800,000. That's the staggering number of Americans who have literally lost their lives to opioid overdoses over the last 24 years. It's exactly why this isn't just some localized issue, it's a massive warning sign. This impacts global healthcare, right down to your local pharmacy. Global health delegates are looking at the international market right now and seeing the exact same ingredients for a crisis, just wrapped up in different packaging and pushed through different channels.
We are actually already seeing the devastating statistical impact of prescription opioids across Europe. In England and Wales, a shocking 47% of all drug poisoning deaths involve opiates. Yet, when a German regulatory committee thought about tightening restrictions on Tramadol back in 2010 to combat misuse, Grunenthal stepped right in. They allegedly lobbied against it, warning it would send a bad signal globally. Investigators later found a huge conflict of interest. The head of that very working group held a professorship sponsored by, you guessed it, Grunenthal. So unsurprisingly, Tramadol remained loosely regulated in Germany.
But the fallout absolutely isn't contained to just Europe. As Tramadol's patents expired, the catastrophe spread like wildfire to West Africa. The market there has been completely flooded with cheap generics and illegally trafficked counterfeits coming out of India and China. The sheer volume is mind-boggling. In Cameroon, researchers actually found synthetic tramadol contaminating the soil and the groundwater. It has sparked this massive, totally unregulated health crisis, devastating the lives of everyday working folks, like Zico, that moto taxi driver we talked about earlier in Togo, who now relies on counterfeits just to function.
Part 4. Pushing tapentadol globally. As Tramadol basically became a generic free-for-all, Grunenthal needed to secure its revenue stream. So they rolled out tapentadol. It's a newer, heavily patented, and much stronger flagship opioid, specifically designed to replace Tramadol in the global market.
And to make sure tapentadol succeeded, Grunenthal deployed that exact same soft power playbook, but on a global scale. Investigators found they funneled over $9 million into more than 900 European patient groups. They sponsored pain associations across Latin America that successfully lobbied to loosen prescription regulations. They even funded Spanish-language medical training platforms. In Mexico, training materials were found actively downplaying the drug's respiratory risks and addiction potential to doctors. Astonishingly, those materials were only taken down when the company was directly confronted by journalists.
Which leads us to some incredibly damning internal communications. See, Grunenthal had partnered with Johnson & Johnson in the US, pushing this theory that tapentadol's dual-action mechanism inherently reduced its addiction risk. But an internal email from a collaborating researcher said this, and I quote, "I don't know of any evidence to support that, but I can live with the people at J&J believing this to be true." Wow. It's a shocking admission, especially given Grunenthal's strict public defense that all their marketing is based purely on verified peer-reviewed scientific data.
Part 5. A world without pain. And this kind of brings our narrative full circle, forcing us to examine the incredibly tightrope between corporate accountability and true medical necessity. Grunenthal defends their products by stating that medical opioids are an absolutely vital, necessary last resort for patients suffering from severe trauma or illnesses like cancer.
So, the crucial point is summarized perfectly by their own corporate vision statement. Together, we strive to make it possible a world free of pain. It is a utopian, honestly brilliant marketing slogan. But when we contrast that polished vision with the harsh reality on the ground, the addiction, the forged prescriptions, the fatal overdoses of people like Brad in Australia and Marco in Germany, we realize that a world entirely free of pain just doesn't exist, and the relentless corporate pursuit of it often ends up generating entirely new kinds of suffering. So I want to leave you with this final, vital question to think about. As these synthetic drugs continue to weave their invisible thread across the globe, where exactly does the responsibility end? Does it lie with the patient who naturally trusts the pill they're handed by a doctor? With the pharmaceutical company utilizing subtle influence to maximize their global reach? Or with the national regulators who fail to see the crisis until it's far too late? It's a massive, deadly puzzle of global medicine, and understanding these moving parts is the only way we can ever begin to solve it.